I want to introduce to you the next President of the United States, Andrew Yang.
Hello everyone, good morning. Good morning. This is my mic. Yes. I have to say, it feels a little bit like a weekend somehow. Like on the ride over, I was like, what day of the week is it? That's what happens when you run for president. Just want to thank you so much for coming out. Thank Adam for his leadership and incredible work in the community. And Rev Wendy from coming all the way to DC for joining us for the tour. Excited to get to know you all and talk a little bit more about my own values and journey.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation, to get this conversation on record. Thank you so much, Andrew. I love being part of campaigns. Great coming up here from DC. I'm originally from Ohio, so I'm kind of used to this weather. And I got a great chance to see the Hawkeyes and the Cyclones play last night. Good game. I don't know who won. I'm not getting that. All right. But this morning, we're going to just take a few questions. I want to ask Andrew and Reverend Adam to share a little bit about faith and the role faith sort of plays in politics and even in the campaign. So oftentimes faith-related questions come up along the campaign trail. So we wanted to take a time this morning to talk a little bit more intimately about how faith informs you, Andrew, or informs us even as ministers who get involved in the political arena, and to find out more about how faith may feed your vision for what you see happening in the country. So I want to start. I'll ask Andrew a question, and then I'll let you chime in if you'd like, Reverend Adam, and we'll just kind of go from there. Everybody okay with that?
Good. Yep.
Good. So the first question will go to Andrew. Andrew, can you share a little bit about your faith journey? I've heard you talk a lot about, and in some instances, having grown up in a secular household. Could you elaborate on that a little bit for me?
As you said, I did grow up in a secular household. My parents met as graduate students from Taiwan. So they met out west in California, and then I was born in upstate New York. And I thought about it. I could not remember my parents ever actually talking about their own religion growing up. And yet, as a young boy, I had this instinctive faith in something bigger than us, God, a higher power. And many of my relatives were Christian. So what we would do is sometimes for various major holidays, we would go to church and service. And so we were exposed to it, but then my parents never talked about their own faith or beliefs. You don't know this story. When I got to college, I had this massive crush on this Christian girl, and so then I wound up going to church, because I think that's what happens in many cases.
You never go to church to meet women, ever.
Yeah. I hope that's not an unusual story. And so I always had this sort of attraction to the communities of faith. And then I was very, very fortunate to have married my wife Evelyn, who was brought up Christian. And then we started attending church together, and now we attend church regularly, and our boys are in Sunday school and are being brought up Christian. And I'm thrilled with that. Like, I see the impact it has on them, having them ask questions about God and Jesus. It's a source of real strength and joy for me and the family, though I would be the first to say that my own journey is still in progress.
Thank you. And I'm sure you, as a reverend, can relate to that. You know, when we meet those that are on a spiritual journey, what's that like?
To meet those who are on a spiritual journey?
Yeah.
We're all on some sort of spiritual journey, right. I would say. You know, I don't even know how I even became a pastor. I went to college. I went to Luther College. I'm going to get some booze here. That's the other. This is a Lutheran institution. And one of the things that we value is education. And Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., but the fat German beer drinking Martin Luther. Yeah.
Martin Luther's a big deal too.
Yeah. He's a reformer. You know what? Yeah. Anyways, I think faith journey comes differently for us all. What has kind of brought me into this mostly is, when I was 13 years old, my dad died, and so I had bigger questions about the world. And I've always been connected with the church through family traditions. And when I went to Luther, the intellectual piece stirred in me, and it just led me to more God questions, and I still have a lot of God questions. So it brings me a lot of joy to see people struggling and working with their faith and those bigger than life questions, because I think that's a deep part of us in who we are.
Thank you very much. Now, Andrew, you mentioned Evelyn, who is lovely, by the way, and you talked about her role in sort of introducing you, bringing the children and the family into the faith, but I've also heard you talk about her response when you approached her with the idea of running for the presidency of the United States. I think one of the first things she said was, what about health care? I think that was the first question.
Yeah, that was one.
But then after that, she said something along the lines of, she saw something in you and she realized that you almost had to do this, almost as if this was more of a mission or a call. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, certainly, if you rewind 2 years ago, there was no one knocking down Andrew Yang's door saying run for president. Let's put it that way. That the decision to run had to be very much one of service, because I was completely anonymous. My mailing list was literally just my Gmail address book. And so if you decide to take that kind of path, then you need to be driven by something much, much bigger. And Evelyn saw that immediately. I mean, she knows, we know each other very, very well, and she knows that I would never, I would never want to be away from her and the kids if it wasn't for something fundamental and important. And I think she believed in me that we could get to this point where now I'm number 5 in the polls. I'm one of only 7 candidates to qualify for next December's debate. We do have, or not next week's debate. We do have this joke where I say to her that she'd only come out on the trail after I'd broken through to a certain level. But the truth is she had her hands full with the boys. And anytime someone thanks me for running, I say, thank my wife, because she's been sacrificing much more than I have.
Yeah, but you could talk about that sacrifice.
Yes, and one of the things that I really appreciate about hearing your story is that you talk about your kids. It sounds like they're very important. And I'm also aware that your grandmother died recently. I'm just curious, what kind of impact did she have on your life and how you formed the world and stirred that spirit of faith? Was she a Christian at all, or was she involved in any type of faith tradition?
My grandmother was not Christian. But I have to say, to the extent that I have this spirit of fellowship, it does come from my grandmother and my mother. My father is sort of a roughneck, in a a very affectionate way. Like he grew up on a peanut farm in Asia with no floor, and had a relatively rugged upbringing. I was always very scared of my dad growing up, and he's not the sort of person that's writing a lot of Christmas cards, let's put it that way. And as you can imagine with different relationships, my mom picked up that slack. My mom very much was the person who'd send Christmas cards and thank you gifts and just look out for everyone. And so to the extent that I feel that spirit of fellowship, it's from my grandmother, my mother, that side of the family, for sure.
Yeah, and we do We bless your grandmother. We certainly bless your family for allowing you to make the sacrifice of
You know, and people have been wishing me condolences for my grandmother's passing. And I'm obviously very sad because my mother is sad. At the same time, she was 95 years old, had 6 grandchildren, 6 great-grandchildren, was in a lot of pain down the stretch. And so her passing seems like as much of a blessing as anything else. She was surrounded by family. It was very, very touching where the only thing she did in terms of actually getting her attention and energy up was watching me in the debates. If you can imagine watching, if you can imagine watching your grandson on the debate stage. But so when people console me, I have to say, like, I genuinely feel like she's in a much better place now. She's happier, healthier, and she'd lived as full a life as one could hope for.
Wonderful. So, to the campaign trail then, and the role of faith. How have you, if at all, seen faith or spirituality playing out on the campaign trail, either for you or in some of the meetings or that you've had or relationships that you've formed?
This campaign has been such a journey of fellowship, and I have to say that people underestimate how human running for president or running for any political office is. And how many of you all have like run for political office, even locally? So I sense there are always a few people in this sort of gathering. And what I tell people is that if you run for local office, that's harder than running for president in many respects. Because people know exactly who you are, they know where you live, they're gonna see you in the grocery store, and if you don't show up to something, they'll notice and miss you. Whereas for me, frankly, if the presidential candidate doesn't show up to something, no one notices. They're like, ah, he's someplace else. So when you run for office, it's much more, and you all know this, like people sometimes attribute some kind of vainglorious motivation to a political candidate, and you have to try, I wish you could all say to them, being like, you would have to be a really terrible human being to do this for some kind of ego-driven reasons, because it's much more ego-punishing than ego-gratifying most all the time, you know what I mean? So you end up with many periods of reflection where you're looking at yourself and you're saying, why am I doing this? But in the case of this campaign, I have felt buoyed and invigorated by other people everywhere I've gone. And that was even true when the crowds were like, the crowds were like 4 or 5 people instead of 400 or 500. I have to say that Iowa has been responsible for this campaign's growth in such fundamental ways. This is my 23rd time in the state. I've been coming here once a month for the last 2 years, essentially. And it was an Iowa newspaper that first included me in a poll. Just even to include my name in a poll was actually a very big step.
That's a big deal.
It was. It was the Des Moines Register, and then CNN takes its cues from the Des Moines Register, and so they're like, I guess this guy's now on polls. And then other people looked and said, he's on their poll, so I guess he should be on our poll? So the sense that this campaign has been driven by the people here in Iowa, the people of this country, certainly not me, has been with us the entire time and has been fueling our success and growth.
Pastor Adam, was there anything in particular resonated with you regarding the campaign that garnered your support?
Well, you have to understand I've been pretty apolitical my whole life. I was once a Republican, never been a Democrat, and probably the majority of my life I've been very stubborn, independent. We're close to the same age, so that's kind of the extra, rebellion type of a thing. But I have in my work, I've been working with demography and just paying attention to all the different shifts in society, how technology has affected those shifts. And I was just listening, I was going to bed and I was listening to a Joe Rogan podcast. And a lot of people have kind of come into attention with Joe Rogan's podcast. And I said, man, this guy really thinks. And I really like the way he thinks. I like the way he thinks about the problems differently. And I like to think, I love the way he does the solution. So that led me into buying your book. I bought it on Amazon, actually. So
Everyone does, man. I use the Amazon link.
yeah. Anyways,
I'm actually going to do Barnes and Noble now.
yeah. So I read your book, and it sealed the deal for me. It scared the crap out of me when I read the first half of the book, and when I read the second half of the book, I just felt this overwhelming sense of hope that there's something new and different coming. And so I gave $20 to your campaign. I said, I got to give this guy a shot. Whoa, $20.
That was early on then, too. You were OG.
Yeah. I was one of the, and so I gave $20 to your campaign, and that spurred somebody from your campaign. I thought he was your relative or some Ping Yang called me, and they needed staffing housing. And
Not related.
not related, yeah, he told me that. So I had a lot of fun with him. By the way, I've been working with this campaign just off and on with their staffers, Al and Nancy, and there's a Maggie, and this is a super fun group of people to work with. I've had a lot of fun doing this.
That brings me a lot of joy. I mean, this has to be the campaign of humanity and joy. I'm so glad you've had that experience.
I like your humanity, your focus quite a bit. And the solutions, I've been following UBI. I had to look them up, but I read research by a Guy Standing. I know you use Andy Stern quite a bit about UBI. Guy Standing makes kind of a social justice argument for UBI, and that's kind of a centerpiece of your campaign. It's not. I hear it clearly. What you're with UBI is this is an essential piece to your campaign, but it's not the solution. It's per se. It's a piece of the puzzle that moves us towards a more whole country. But this guy, Guy, yeah, he's an English professor in England, and this guy, Guy. This is messing me up. But he makes the argument from a social justice standpoint. He's done research, over 30 years of research, and he's gone into villages. And what this has done to the villages, and it completely took the stigma away. Some people were having bigger huts than other people huts, and there was no resentment with this. And I found that fascinating. So.
Yeah, I had the privilege of sitting with Martin Luther King III after the last debate in Atlanta, and he talked about how this was his dad's vision. Imagine being able to refer to Martin Luther King as dad. And when he said that, I was like, Dad, wow. But he talked about how, from a social justice standpoint, putting economic resources into people's hands, it fulfills the vision where everyone is loved, everyone has value, we're all responsible for each other. And so I came to it from a combination of places where I'm a numbers guy, and I looked at the numbers and I said, this is shocking and horrifying. We are going to push millions of Americans into distress, and that we're in the midst of doing so right now. But then from a values perspective, this is something that people have been fighting for decades. And I talked to Evelyn, my wife, about how could you go from Martin Luther King championing it in the 60s, it's mainstream, 1,000 economists endorse it, to it takes the far out futurist Asian guy to try and drag it back into the mainstream 50 years later. What happened in those 50 years? And Evelyn and I concluded that what happened was that we confused economic value and human value over those 50 years and got collectively brainwashed to think of ourselves as economic inputs or economic actors, and that if you don't have economic value, you no longer have any value. And so you have a society that ends up putting the pressure on individuals and say, what's that, your factory closed? Well, that's on you, like adapt, or something ridiculous. Or what, your coal mine closed? I guess we're gonna try and turn you into coders. The entire thing is premised on the fact that our value is determined by what the market says it is, and that's a relatively recent invention. We did not think that 50 years ago, but we think that today.
So then that leads into my next question, which was, which of your policies in particular do you believe best resonate with communities of faith? And would you say that universal basic income certainly would be one of those, or what other?
Well, certainly alleviating poverty is something that I believe many religious communities would agree with based on scripture.
And the non-religious as well.
And the non-religious, agree. Like many people just look up and say, in the richest, most advanced country in the history of the world, we should eradicate poverty. We have the resources to do so. It would alleviate untold human misery, would make us stronger, healthier, improve relationships, decrease domestic violence. So these are things that I think that we can agree on. But to me, the other thing that's getting lost is this confusion between human flourishing and economic progress. Where right now we're being guided by corporate profits and GDP measurements, even as our life expectancy has declined for the last 3 years because suicides and drug overdoses are both at record highs. Also at record highs, stress, anxiety, depression, mental illness, financial insecurity, student loans. So if you have the wrong measurements for your society, it's going to be disastrous over time because you're going to think, and you all had this feeling, where you'll see the headlines and say, well, I guess headline unemployment's low and GDP is up, but then you have this sinking feeling, you're like, why does it not feel like things are going great where I live in Iowa? Your feelings are right, the numbers are wrong. And what we have to do is we have to use the correct numbers so that we can all see that we're in a mental health depression, we're in a wellness depression, we're in a community depression in terms of involvement, volunteerism, engagement, civic relationships. If you had the right measurements in place, you would see that we're actually falling apart.
Good, then what would be your, not good that we're falling apart, by the way, but what then would be your message to those who are motivated to vote or select a candidate based on their faith or based on their values? For some voters, where a person stands and what their faith is or is not is very important. So what would your message be to those potential voters?
I would say for them to search their hearts and determine what their own values are, and then support a campaign or candidate that has a vision that aligns with your values. And of course, no candidate is going to align in every single respect. And I don't think that should be necessarily the expectation or goal. But then what are like the very big things that you're concerned about, and how can we actually make progress, not at the margins or the edges, but in a way that would allow us to really look our kids in the eyes and say, we're going to leave you a country, a society, a community, a planet that we're proud of. Because unfortunately, many people feel the same way you have, until recently, which makes me very grateful, where politics is not that relevant, and it's like these arguments are happening between like these particular bounds, and people are fed up. You know, especially, I have to say, I feel your pain here in Iowa. I just turned on the TV for 15 minutes and I saw at least 6 ads, none of them mine. But I saw at least 6 ads, and if you're a normal human being in this state, you'd be like, oh no, it's political season again. Like, I have to, wade through all of this stuff. It's very easy to get alienated by it and then not engage more deeply as to which campaign may actually solve some of the fundamental problems that you're concerned about for yourself, your family members, your community.
Excellent. So just a couple more questions. One of the things I've been blown away by, quite honestly, is the response to the campaign and to you. Many of the supporters have shared uplifting stories about the impact that the campaign's making on them personally, spiritually, mentally. What are your thoughts about this impact? What do you attribute that to?
It has been the most uplifting experience when people come to me and say, Andrew, I was depressed and you helped lift me out of my depression. That's so touching. My brother is a clinical psychology professor, And I believe that we have, a mental health crisis in this country, and the fact that people find this campaign so uplifting that it gives them hope. One of the things I learned for myself, and I can relate to a lot of what you were saying, maybe it is the Gen X thing, it's true. 10 years ago in the financial crisis, I felt terrible about the state of the country because we crashed the economy, and worse yet, no one was taking any accountability or responsibility. People were getting paid hundreds of millions of dollars, and we're just like, well, who could know? And then when the government had a choice between bailing out Wall Street and keeping Americans in their homes, what did we choose? Bailing out Wall Street, $4 trillion into the banks. Called it quantitative easing in the hopes of confusing people so we wouldn't notice. But we chose the banks over our people, and I was so disgusted by this. I said, wow, I can't believe this is what we've come to. And it struck me so hard that I quit my job, started a nonprofit, and spent 7 years building and running that nonprofit. And so those of you who work in volunteer capacities, I understand that spirit of service. And that was actually probably the toughest conversation with Evelyn, because she married me and I was a fairly normal guy. And then I was like, hey, I'm now going to quit this job, donate some of our money to start a nonprofit, go without salary, and build this nonprofit, because I think that having our talent and energies go to Wall Street and create exotic financial instruments is a disaster and a train wreck. And I want to try and show people that we can do something more generative and positive. And so this is a very long-winded way of saying, I only started to feel better about the problems when I took action. And so for the folks that felt depressed, I think that the reason why this campaign has made them feel better is because they feel like they can take action. They feel like they can do something concrete and real that will potentially solve the problems that are making them sad. And as human beings, we find that to be the biggest source of uplift. If you have a problem and someone says, hey, feel better, like, it doesn't really work that well, honestly. You know what I mean? But if you say, hey, here's like a set of steps you can take that you actually have a chance to contribute to solving the problem, then that actually does empower us and make us feel better. That's the only way I found I could feel better about the problems that are facing the country, is doing something about it.
Awesome. Pastor Adam, humanity first is the tagline, and you mentioned that earlier. When you hear that, well, what did you hear? What do you hear in that?
I kind of take a little theological stint on it, seeing the Christ in others. And I guess I kind of want to build on what you were reflecting on, Andrew. I after my journey of reading your book and giving $20, I joined this social media group, Yang Gang. I guess I'm a Yang Ganger now. Yeah. I ran into libertarians. I kind of considered myself somewhat of a libertarian at one time. And progressives and ex-Trump supporters, and just the humanity piece is just the respect, the value that everybody has is felt in the conversations. And if somebody says something kind of off color, there's creative ways to kind of bring that into alignment. And I see that, and the creativity that has happened there's a guy, apparently there's somebody making a video game of you. I don't know if you knew that. Yeah, that's pretty sweet.
I was joking, it's like, I know which character I'm going to play.
Yeah.
I think I saw someone had a tattoo on the back of their leg, too.
Yeah, it just unleashed this great sense of creativity and hopefulness, and it's just been really kind of fun to watch that and see that unfold and kind of be a part of that, you know.
Yeah, it's been fun for me. Like, you get out. I think one of the most gratifying comments I saw was, if Andrew Yang can unify the comment section of a YouTube video, he can unify the country.
There's country music songs, rap songs, and creativity. It's just going everywhere, and it's just really neat.
it's something to see. Well, I want to wrap up then with this, Andrew, then I'll give you a few minutes to just kind of close out if you like. You know, at the end of the day, you mentioned it earlier, running for president is really hard. It's really hard, very taxing. What keeps you going?
It is the people I meet on the trail. It's the fact that people have invested so much of their hope for the future. When I decided to run 2 years ago, I had hopes for the campaign, but I said to myself, like, if this ends with me, the lone voice in the wilderness, 2 years from now, with a group of, two, I would be okay with that. Like, I would live with that because I would have been true to my values. I would have fought for my country, and win or lose, you can sleep at night. But now, coming on the road and seeing that there are groups of people, we have our own fancy bus that the donors, we have to put their names on the side. What invigorates me first and foremost is seeing that we actually can change the course of history for our country. And history can change very, very quickly, particularly when you're in this magical place called Iowa, where each of you has incredible outsized importance in our political system. So I'm energized by the campaign's growth and the energy and the spirit of the people, the creativity. On a very personal level, I do keep a list of things I'm grateful for on my phone. And anytime I start to drag, I just take it out, and it has like the names of my children, the fact that my parents are still alive and with us. And then some really stupid, trivial things, like my favorite pizza place, like a TV show I enjoyed and haven't watched the end of, like just whatever, like the list of things, and you're like, oh yeah, there are all of these like great things in life that that I have to be thankful for. And that's something that I found always just gives me a little bit of perspective.
Wonderful. So why don't you take a few minutes then and just close out here with the crowd. Thank you. Thank you all, certainly. We have a round of applause for Andrew.
Thank you all. It's tremendous to be here today. I'm grateful. I have many Christian relatives. Now my family members are Christian. And one aspect of their faith that I have always struggled with is that when bad things happened to them, or in their community, or like a colleague was laid off or something like that, they would say something along the lines of, like God has a plan, or put your faith in God. And then there was part of me that, found that like, oh, that's very uplifting because they have faith. But then there was part of me, this other part, that said, you should actually be angry about that and change that or fight that. But it's not enough necessarily just to like go along with it and then trust that all is God's plan. I'm angry about what's happened in our communities. And it's going to take people of faith unifying with people who have different beliefs to change the things so that we actually can feel good about ourselves, our communities, our family members, our country. This is going to be an act of sacrifice on the part of many, many people, of commitment, of time away from family, of potentially difficult conversations with friends and neighbors. I don't know if this conception is something that my family members who are Christian who seem very accepting of things would agree with me on. But this, to me, is what brought me before you here today. This is what has energized my campaign, is that it's not enough to believe we can do better. We have to fight for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Put the money in our hands. Put the money in our hands. Put the money in our hands. Can we afford it? Yes. Will it cause inflation? No. Is it awesome? Yes. Is anyone trying to make it happen? Yeah, that guy.